Ellie, how are you feeling?
Okay, how are you?
Good. You look great.
Thank you.
You look.
I'm leaving tomorrow.
I saw you a couple weeks ago, and I don't know. You look like you're feeling better.
Yeah, I'm leaving tomorrow to New Jersey for Pesach.
No wonder.
Yeah.
No wonder. That's great. That's
very
nice.
How's everybody doing?
Okay,
well,
Rabbi.
thank you. You?
Good.
Okay,
Everyone's prep is going okay?
Yeah.
We'll give people another minute or so, and then we'll get started.
Are you wearing your kittel?
Yeah, it's like we're at the Pesach Seder right now. It's good.
Oh,
I thought he was a
Shabbat
doctor.
HaGadol Drasha, for both of them, we'll get dressed up. It's fine.
I thought we were
I'm
in the operation
getting
room.
ready for
Yeah.
Drasha for Shabbat HaGadol on Zoom. Okay, thanks.
there you go.
Okay, I think we're gonna get started. And as people come on, they'll come on. So I'm gonna ask for some participation, but I'm gonna mute everybody for now, and then feel free to unmute yourselves to answer any questions, or to ask questions, and or you can always put them into the chat, and I will try and get them at a natural stopping point. But the goal for tonight's class is to start the process of thinking and asking questions. And so if you have anything that you want to ask at any point in time, don't hesitate. The structure of tonight's class, which we'll get to the source sheet soon enough, but the structure of tonight's class is going to be a bona fide classical Gemara shir, trying to analyze a particular line from the Mishnah, which gets interpolated by the Gemara. And we're going to use the 4 different approaches, 3.5 approaches of the Rishonim, particularly the last approach of the Rishonim, to try to create a model for Jewish growth that is pretty similar to the whole concept of a vaccine. And you can take it or leave it. These ideas are my own, so I'm very comfortable if you don't agree with my takeaways, but I think that it's a worthwhile study. Just before we get started, a couple of shout outs. So I learned the second chapter of Psachim with Mori Rabbi, Rav Rosenzweig, and part of the shir that I'm going to be giving tonight are based off of aspects of shir back in the day. It was probably at this point around 10 years ago in terms of when I did this. But thankfully, the second thank you is to David Weiss, who is Rosenzweig's son-in-law and was a very close friend of mine who was in shir with me, because David was one of the masters of writing notes and then resynthesizing Rav Rosenzweig's shiurim. And I still have David's notes, and it was not so hard to go back and find. I knew what I was looking for, and so it wasn't so hard to go back and find what I needed to find. So thankfully, between the two of that, I was able to recreate some aspects of the learning that I did many, many years ago, and then hopefully adapt it for tonight's purposes. So what I want to start off with is a Mishnah, and we could spend a while on this, but I want to give you guys a moment to read through this Mishnah and to just ask questions. One of the reasons that we learn how to learn Mishnah is that Mishnah is meant to be a shorthand version of what the Gemara will eventually take from that Mishnah, meaning the Torah Shabbat Peh, all of the corpus of the oral law comes from little details of the Mishnah that are questionable or extra or whatnot. And obviously there are certain things that are passed down that you would never be able to read from the Mishnah, but very often, at least the questions that the Gemara will ask, the answers are often harder to know unless you already knew the information. But the questions are almost always readily available. and it's a good skill to work on. So we'll give you guys another minute or so. This also gives people who are a little bit late an extra minute to get on to the call. So I want you to read this mission to yourselves and just jot down any questions that jump out at you. And we'll reconvene when it hits 8:20. Okay, does anyone have any thoughts? And I know that it was very little time, but any thoughts, anything jump out at you as extraneous, superfluous, not making sense? Just anything, any questions jump out at you? Just unmute yourselves and share with the group.
The first part's very straightforward. That you cannot derive any benefit from it, even as insignificant as using it for fuel.
Okay, good. So that's really the middle section over here. But here's, let's just read through the mission together, and then if you think of anything as we go through it, just stop me. So we don't actually paskin like this Mishnah, right? The Mishnah starts off Kol shah shemuter lechol machil lebehema l'chayil ofos. As long as you can eat chametz, you can feed your animals chametz. Umocher lenachri, you can also sell it to a non-Jew. Umuter banaso, and you can benefit from it. Right, so we have this hour in between where you can no longer eat the chametz, but you still can benefit from it. That's normally when we do the sale and everything else in a normal year. So that is actually how we follow. But there was a couple of different views in the Mishnah already, and one view was that it's all or nothing, right? It's all okay, and then at some point it all becomes not okay. And so this Mishnah is reflecting that idea. For me, one of the basic questions that you ask on this first line already is, if you can feed it to your animals and you can sell it to a non-Jew, these are the quintessential definitions of getting benefit. So once you say these two, mutter banaso, right, you can get benefit. Of course you can get benefit. You can feed it to your animal. Feeding it to your animal is getting benefit. You could either have just said mutter banaso, or you could have just said machal behemo mochel lenachri, and you would have known mutter banaso. So again, why does the Mishnah feel the need to include, right, each of these clauses, particularly this catch-all of mutter banaso? Then we say avar zmano, once the time passes, we have to figure out what that is. Asur banaso, at that point, the hana is now no longer okay, to the point that, which is what Fred's point, lo yasikbo tanor v'kirayim, you cannot even use it as fuel. Right, as pathetic of a hana as that is, once the time is up, even to burn it and to use while it's being burnt, to use it as fuel would be problematic. And now we have a little bit of a non sequitur or a separate clause. Maybe there's a relationship between the first and second half, which could have been another question. And what does the first half of the Mishnah have to do with the second half of the Mishnah? The last half of the Mishnah is a debate between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Ein bir chametz ela sreifa, the only way that you can do the destruction of chametz is through burning. The rabbi said, "Af meforer v'zorer leruach umatil yam." You could also break it up and throw it into the wind, or throw it into the sea. Now, generally speaking, we paskin like the rabbis, but we're machmir for the view of Rabbi Yehuda, right? So you can really fundamentally get rid of chametz in any way, but we prefer that you burn your chametz, which is why there's a whole concept of biur chametz, which ends up with the burning of the chametz normally on Erev Pesach. This year is a great example, though, where we're not going to be able to burn our chametz because it's Erev Shabbos. And so this year in particular, if you have chametz on Shabbos, then you will have to follow the view of the Chachamim to get rid of it in some other fashion, right? Throwing it in the wind or flushing it down the toilet, throwing it into the ocean of some sort. So thus far, takeaways. Why is it that we have this, right, clause of mutter banaso if we already know that from the fact that you can feed it to animals or sell it to a non-Jew? And is the relationship between part 1 of the Mishnah and part 2 of the Mishnah, part 1 talking about the Isser Achila, the prohibition for eating and the prohibition from getting benefit, is there any relationship with that to the conversation about how you have to dispose of your chametz, either through streifa, according to Rabbi Yehuda, or that you can throw it into the sea or sprinkle it into the wind, according to the Chacham. Now, before we jump into this and try to analyze this, I want to just take one step back and talk about chametz, because chametz really is what I would call a sui generis isser. It's a one of a kind. Chametz is literally the staple of the Jewish diet, right? I mean, anyone who tries to go into Atkins diet, and then you have a Yom Tov come up, and you have to have bread, and then you have to have more bread, and you have to have more bread. We have bread at everything, right? Even when we don't need to have bread, we include bread, right? All the traditional meals, right? Bagels and lox, right? Challah. I mean, these are all the classical Jewish foods. We always have bread. And so for the classical, right, fundamental food, which we literally eat at everything, to all of a sudden become not just prohibited, right, but it becomes prohibited to a point that there's an Isser Kares. Kares, you get, right, you're cut off, your life is cut short from heaven. That is literally the most strict punishment for any positive commandment, right, right, I mean, I guess it's a negative commandment, but still, but for any machalos asuros, for any forbidden foods, right? Most of the time, if you eat non-kosher, you're going to get lashes. You're going to be punished. But karet, you're not going to get cut off. So the punishment is so intense. And the fact is that it literally is a part of. Such a staple of the Jewish diet. That's fascinating. And additionally, there is a prohibition against owning chametz. Right? There's no prohibition against owning almost anything else. Right? There's a conversation about maybe being a trader of pigs. But short of that, there are very little non-kosher things that you can't own. And not only is there a problem of owning it, but we have a seek and destroy directive, right? Bedikas chametz, biur chametz. The only other place that we have in anywhere else in our tradition, the concept of bedika and biur, right, of search and destroy, is avodah zarah, right? It's idolatry, which is one of the big three. So all of a sudden, literally the staple of the Jewish diet turns for a week into this noxious, poisonous substance that we need to stay away from. And when you think about it, it's crazy because when the week is up, it reverts back to being the staple of our diet. It's not like all of a sudden we're like, oh, that was bad, we should stay away from chametz, and then we should just stay away forever. No, as soon as Pesach is over, right, chametz comes right back into our diet. And because of this, because of how sui generis, how unique chametz is compared to all other machalot asurot, forbidden foods, because of that, the rabbis try to pump up the idea of chametz by comparing it to the Yetzer Hara. They compare it to the evil inclination. They say just like the evil inclination, right, pumps you up, right, and then gets you in trouble. So chametz, it rises, it has that same idea. But what's so fundamental to remember is that the rabbis teach us that there was a point where they tried to get rid of certain Yetzer Haras. They tried to get rid of certain drives from mankind because they thought the world would be better off if there was no sexual drive. And so they removed the sexual drive for a brief period of time. And as a result, everybody stopped having kids. There were no more children in the world for, again, this very short period of time. And right, even the chickens didn't hatch eggs. It was a very strange time. You can hear my daughter in the background. So you have this short period of time where, right, all of a sudden, right, they tried to get rid of the Yetzer Hara and it didn't work. It really didn't work. So what did? They reverted back and they said, you know what, it's not going to work. The drives of humanity are very important. They actually did get rid of the drive for avodah zarah, according to Chazal, which whatever that means, that there was at one point this real urge to bow down and worship other things, and that urge is no longer here. And when we got rid of that, we got rid of prophecy too. That was kind of the two parts of that idea that kind of got lost in the same time. So you have this notion that these urges and drives are particularly important, and we're going to have to come back to that because at the end of the day, right, we have to find a way to control it, to harness it, to hone it, right? That's the goal. That's our job with the Yetzer Hara. And so I want to talk more about that, but we'll come back to this whole conversation about chametz and how it's compared to the Yetzer Hara and what that means for us. What are we supposed to be doing with that? That's going to be kind of where we come back to at the end. I just wanted to introduce it at this point in the beginning. So let's jump back into our shir right now. So again, we have this Mishnah in Psachim. And the Mishnah in Psachim talks about the fact that normally the Isser Achila, the prohibition of eating chametz and the prohibition of benefiting from chametz, they come together. And we noted that you could have said that one line, and you could basically erase the line of Machil Behema, L'chayil Ofos, and Mochel Nachri, because those are all examples of benefiting from the chametz. So let's jump into the Gemara itself. Says the Gemara, and this is the Gemara on the next page. It's 2 dots to a 2 dots, even though it's only a line. So it's a great Gemara to really delve into. Mutter bana. And this is what I said. Pshita, that's the Gemara's question. The Gemara's question is, that is obvious. I know that it's mutter bahana because you can sell it to a non-Jew, because you can feed it to your animals. So of course you can benefit from it. You just gave me 2 examples of benefit. Says the Gemara, lo, no. Sricha, we need this to teach us a different halacha. What's the halacha that we're coming to teach us? Shecharko kodem zmano, that you are singeing or scorching the chametz before the zman ha'isr, before the time when the rabbis established that the isr chametz kicks in, right? Meaning the biblical time is when Pesach starts, but the rabbis said, no, it starts even earlier than that, right? It starts in the 6th hour, right? The 6th hour already, the isr chametz starts. So kamash malan kide Rava. So what is this whole concept of scorching before the time? It's like the view of Rava. What did Rava say? The Amar Rava charko kodem zmano, muter bana afilu la'achar zmano. If you singe or scorch the chametz before the zman ha'isr, before the time when the isr chametz kicks in, then you can benefit from that chametz even after the time when chametz is normally asr. So the question that we have to analyze is, what is the definition of charko? What does that mean? Scorched, right? Anyone want to throw out a possibility? What does it mean it has to be scorched? Anybody want to take a stab at it?
Well, maybe that that it's burnt past the point of being edible.
Perfect, right? So we're going to have to define even what you just said, but it could be that
unrecognizable.
Right? Unrecognizable. Okay, good. I like that. That's actually going to be helpful also. Anybody else? Okay, so we're going to get into these different ways of framing. What does charko mean? And then once we have those established, we'll basically have a better sense of what the Gemara is actually saying. But before we can even jump into the charko question specifically, it's important to always have in mind the broader conversation that happens throughout Shas. And so when you talk about charko, right? So it sounds like somehow when you do charko to the chametz, it loses its identity as chametz. Something that you did there makes it lose its identity as chametz. So if I were to ask you, what about elsewhere in the Torah? Do we have other places where foods lose their identity at a certain point? And if so, what is that point? Okay, so that's the question that I want to raise first, and just review a couple of Gemaras that address this question in other areas of the Talmudic corpus. The first is actually in Psachim, and the case is hapas she'ifsha. So the case is bread that became moldy. So the Gemara says hapas she'ifsha v'nifsala mila'achol la'adam, right? And this is basically what Fred had said, right? It got moldy to the point that a human being would not be able to consume that bread anymore. V'hakelev yachol la'ochla, but a dog could still eat the bread. A little gross, may not want your dog to eat it, but if it was in the trash can, the dog would still eat it. Mitame tumas ochlin b'kebetza. If you have a kibetza, a egg's worth of bread, right, as a volume of an egg's worth of bread, so it still is subject to the laws of tumas ochlin, which basically means that it can become tameh, and it can transmit tumah, which was not true if it was smaller than that, or if it became, right, totally to the point where it was not even edible to a dog. At that point, it loses what's called its shem ochlin. It loses its status as food because it is not even edible to a dog. And at that point, it no longer transmits tumah with a kibetza because it's not food anymore. So it would follow different rules of tumah. Okay, so what we find from this Gemara is that as long as food is still edible to a dog, it doesn't quite lose its status. And this is talking about bread, right? The bread is still considered bread, still considered chametz, right? We're talking impsachim. It's still considered chametz until it becomes inedible for a dog. So we'll come back to that. Rashi here, Hol umitchila nires la'adam, since at first this bread was edible to a human being, yardo lo toras tuma, so the laws of tuma and tara, right, came upon it. The ain olam imena ad nitfasel me'achilas kelev, and the threshold for removing it from the category of food is that at this point, if a dog won't eat it anymore, it's no longer food. It's lost its identity as food. However, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah has a different standard, and this is talking about nevela, right, unshechted meats. Rabbi Shimon, my taima, the Tanya, we learned in a brayso, lo tochlu kol nevela, lager asher b'sharecha, right? So you cannot eat a unshechted animal. You should give it to a sojourner by the gate, right? So you should give it to a non-Jew, a ger toshav, someone who follows the Jewish law but is not Jewish. So what does the Gemara learn from this? Kol harayuya lager kriya nevela. If it's still, right, befitting to give to a non-Jew, meaning it hasn't rotted, it hasn't become disgusting, then you can call it still a nevela. She'en roi lager. But if you can no longer give it to a non-Jew, and they would look at it and say that's disgusting, that's not edible, then eina kuruya nevela. In other words, the definition for whether something is considered food or not, in this case, this meat, is the qualification of will a human being eat it, not will a dog eat it. Okay? So in the context of chametz, by pas she'ifsha, we see that the category is a dog. When it comes to other machalot asurot, when it comes to nevela, we have evidence that as soon as it becomes no longer edible to a human being, that is already enough to remove it from the category of food. You're following me so far? These two different pieces of evidence. So now we have to go back to Charko and figure out what are you doing to this chametz that you're making it to a point that now after the time when chametz is normally no longer allowed, you can still use it. So let's take a look. The first position is the position of the Rambam. Now the Rambam says, and this might be the same as Tosfos too, but it might be unique. So we'll start with the Rambam. We'll start with Maimonides. Rambam says, "V'im sarfu kodem shishis." If you burn, right, he uses the word burn. So you burn it before the 6th hour. Hareza muter lehanos b'pchamin shelo b'tocha pesach. You can use the coals that are the result of burning that chametz on Pesach. Avalim sarfu misha shisas umala. But if you burn it after the 6th hour and onwards, ho'ovahu aser ba'naya, since it was already aser ba'naya before you started burning it, hareza lo yasik bo tanor v'kerayim, you cannot even use it as fuel. Lo ya'afebo v'lo yivashel bo, you can't bake or cook with it. V'im afa obat bishel osa hapas v'oso atavshel aser ba'naya. And if you do, the resulting food is going to be prohibited from benefit. V'chein hapchamin shelo asurin, and even the coals that come out of it are going to be asur. Ho v'sarfu achar shenesar be'anaya, because it became prohibited it became burnt after it was already prohibited from benefit. So just so you appreciate this, I didn't bring the source down because it would take us too off topic. But the way that most understand the Rambam is actually to connect the two pieces of our Mishnah. There's a concept called nisrafin versus nikbarin, right? When it comes to things that have to be destroyed, there are two different categories: things that have to be burnt and things that have to be buried. The rule is things that have to be burnt, when you burn them, we say na'aseh mitzvaso, you did what you needed to do, and therefore afran mutter, the ashes that came as a result of that are okay. When it's nikbarin, when it's something that's supposed to be buried, there, if you bury it, or even if you choose to burn it, afran eino mutter. The ashes, the result of that is still not mutter. So basically, when you have the more extreme requirement of burning, then as a result, right, it basically frees the object from its isser on the other side of that act. So the way that people understand the Rambam is that when you burned the chametz ahead of time, so basically you made the ashes mutter. You made the ashes okay because we consider the chametz from the Rambam's perspective as like nisrafin. But that's only true if you did it before the Zman Isser. Once the Zman Isser kicks in, at that point, even if you burned it, right, it's not going to help you, which again is interesting. You have to spend a lot of time on this Rambam to really delve into why that is, but it's the first position for us. It's not going to be our focus, so we're going to spend only a little bit of time developing it, but that's the view of the Rambam. Now we're going to see the next two views are going to be much more in line with what we already know. So the Tosafos, the Bali Tosafos, Amsachim, when they read this Gemara, Charko Kodem Zmano, they have a very simple line. Charko Kodem Zmano, Mutter Bana, Afa Achar Zmano. So it's Mutter even after the time. Ukigon Shenifsal Melech O Lekelev, Tebeinan Achar Lo Have Shari. It has to be that you made the chametz inedible, even for a dog. Because if it's not that, if it's any other case, then it should not be okay, because we have the case shari dumya de pasha ifsha, because we should compare it to the case of the moldy bread. In the case of the moldy bread, the time where the moldy bread loses its shem chametz, it loses its status as food, was when it was no longer able, right, to be eaten by a dog. But if it's still edible to a dog, it's still transmitted tumah. It still could become tamei, tumas ochlin. It needed to have a kabetza. It still had the same rules as food. It didn't lose its status until it became edible for a dog. So Tosfos says you just plug it in. The same thing. Pasha Ifsha teaches you that for chametz to lose its status as chametz, what you need to make it so that it's inedible for a dog. So what happens with charko when you singe the chametz? You're singeing it to a point that even a dog will not eat it. Now, the challenge for the view of Tosfos is, why is that true only lifnei zmano, but not la'achar zmano? That's the problem. The problem for the Tosfos is why not, if I find chametz on the first day of Pesach and I burn it to a crisp, and now I say this ashes does no longer has a shame chametz. It's completely not chametz. It doesn't have a status of chametz. So why is it only charko kodem zmano that it's mutter banaso afilu achar zmano? Why not even if I do charko in middle of Pesach, when I finish the process of burning it to the point that it is now ash, why isn't it going to be okay? That's the challenge that Tosfos has to answer. There's different ways of answering it, but that's the problem that Tosfos has. The Ritva quotes the Ra'ah, and he is the next level down. So says the Ritva, Tanu Rabbana, Hapas she'ifsha v'nifsala me'achilas adam v'akelav yachol ochla. Right, so that's the quotation, right? That the moldy bread that was no longer edible to a human being, but still edible to a dog. So Kasav Rabbeinu Yom Tov. So Rabbeinu Yom Tov, which is very possible is the Ritva, which is weird that he's quoting himself. He says, "Midivrei Rav Alfasi," from the words of Rabbi Alfasi, Rav Yitzchak Alfasi, from Fez, Morocco, right? That's what the Alfasi is. The Rif was known as one of the great Rishonim, well respected across all spheres. Nira dechayev levar afilu nifsala me'achilas adam. Shekain kasav ha'im nifsala me'achilas kelev einat tzricha sreifa. Right? So meaning you have to destroy the moldy bread, even if it's inedible for humans already, until it becomes inedible for dogs. Right? But as long as it's still edible to a dog, you still have an obligation to destroy, search and destroy that chametz. Right? And so basically the point, and this is making it very clear, right? According to this reasoning for Rabbi Yom Tov, he is learning two ideas from the Gemara of Pas She'ifsha, from the moldy bread. Number one, that in terms of identity, you have to burn the chametz to the point that it's not edible for a dog in order for it to lose its identity as chametz. And the second one is that the same is true for the rules of tumah, that it has to be burned to the point that it is, right, it has to be moldy to the point that it's not even edible for a dog, for the laws of tumah to no longer apply. Okay, but the truth is, and we'll see this in a second, this is the view of the Ra'ah that we're going to see in the next line. The truth is that the Gemara of Pasha Ifsha never says that you have to destroy the moldy bread. It just says that it's still subject to the laws of Tumah until it reaches a level of, right, not being able to be eaten by a dog. And so perhaps you can say that halacha, right, in terms of the rules of Tumah and Tara, perhaps are retained by this moldy bread until it becomes inedible by a dog. But who's to say that's true about destroying it? Perhaps as soon as it becomes inedible for a human being, that is enough because no human being is going to eat it. And so you already have the destruction of it and you no longer have the requirement to destroy it. So he kind of disentangles the laws of Tumah from the obligation of destroying it. Maybe the Gemara of Pasha Ifsha is only teaching us one law, the law of Tumah. But you have no obligation to destroy this moldy bread that is inedible to human beings. As soon as it becomes possible, as soon as it becomes no longer possible to be eaten by a human being, you don't have to worry about destroying it because it's not going to get eaten. It's not going to get eaten. And this is Vizu Shitas HaRa'ah. This is the view of the Ra'ah. Right, he brings a couple of proofs, which we're not going to get into. But thus far, let's just summarize. We have the view of the Rambam that Charko Kodem Zmano is about turning the chametz into coals before the Zman Isser. If you do the same thing after the Zman Isser, it doesn't work. It doesn't help. The Bali Tosfos say that no, you need to get it to a point where it is not roi lechilas kelev. It can't be eaten by a dog. Okay, so why does that only work before the time but not after the time? And then we have the view of the Ra'ah quoted in the Ritva, that when you go to the Gemara of Pasha Ifsha, that's only teaching you the laws of Tumah and Tara. But when it comes to identity of food and the requirement of destroying it, as soon as it becomes Eina Roi Lachilas Adam, when it's no longer befitting for a human being to eat, it has lost its status of being chametz at that point. Okay. For the Ritva, the strength of the Ritva is that once the time for chametz starts, once the Isser starts, you could argue that at that point, you do require it to actually lose its identity to the point of a dog not eating it. But before the time, right, Kodem Zmano, before chametz kicks in as chametz, right, this actually gets into a broader conversation. How do we view chametz before the Zman Isser? And this is what I was talking about before, how sui generis chametz is, how unique it is. The fact that before the time, the Zman Isser, chametz is completely mutter, it's completely okay. Right? There's a whole conversation of whether or not we consider chametz that's in the walls of a pot isura bala or hetera bala, meaning do we consider that it's mutter stuff going into the walls of the pot, or is it usher things going into the walls of the pot? Because when it went into the walls of the pot, it was mutter, but it was also chametz, right? So how do we view chametz before the zman isser? So one could argue that before the chametz isser kicks in, you already can say that it has the same status of all other machalot asurot. It has the same status of all other forbidden foods. Which, when does it lose its identity as food? Well, you can use the example from Avodah Zarah, that just like nevela loses its identity once it's no longer edible for a human being. That's true about chametz before the zman isser. Once the zman isser is introduced, once chametz is now usser, so at that point it would have a higher level where it would need to also be inedible to dogs, right? That's how you could use this ra'ah to explain why only before the time but not after the time. Okay, so those are the first three positions, and while they're fascinating and interesting, they're not what we're going to be focusing on. So they're important for understanding the range of opinions in this Gemara, in understanding this Gemara. But what I want to look at is what I believe is certainly the most mechudash view in this whole sugya, and it comes from a whole group of Rishonim that are really what we would call kind of the either tier 2, right, or tier 1A, and they're all from Provence. They're all from southern Spain, and this is something I come back to a lot because it's really important for people to understand how this all works. The Rambam, right? He starts his life in southern Spain. He flees to Fez, Morocco, makes his way to Egypt and to Israel, and he stays most of his life in Egypt. He's a classic Sephardi rabbi, posek, writer. The Bali Tosfos operate in Germany and northern France. That's where they are. The Ritva is a classical Sephardi posek, right? The Ritva was a student of the Rashba. The Rashba was the rabbi in Barcelona, right? So you're northern Spain. Again, another classic Sephardi. So we've addressed the positions of some of the major Sephardi and Ashkenazi views. When it comes to the Chachmei Provence, they're in southern France, which is north of Spain and south of northern France. And they were a unique community that didn't follow the minhagim of Ashkenaz or Sfarad, but today they got basically sucked up into one or the other, and they no longer are people who practice Provençal Judaism. However, when you go back to the times of the Rishonim, you have a whole group of rabbis who were specialists from Provence. You have the Ravid, you have the Baal Ma'or, you have, those are probably the main two. You have the Meiri, you have a lot of the people involved in the Maimonidean controversy from Montpellier. You have the Chachmei Lunel, the rabbis from Lunel, a whole bunch of important players. So we're going to see a couple of them tonight, and they're going to argue that Charko does even less than all the previous positions. So come take a look. So we're going to go in the order of least likely candidates for this view to most likely candidates for this view, right? So you'll see the Baal Ma'or is read different ways by different people. It's not clear what he's saying, but the Ravid reads him to put him in this category, but others read him, the Ran and others will see that he don't actually put him in this category. But we're going to start with him because these are the most prominent views in Provence, and then we'll scurry down the list. Hama'or Hakatan. So this is the Baal Ma'or, Rav Zrachia Halevi. So Rav Zrachia Halevi was very young when he wrote his magnum opus, the Baal Ma'or, the Sefer HaMa'or, the Mor Hakatan, and he basically critiques the Rif, Rav Yitzchak Alfasi. If you remember, I said the Rif was basically unanimously loved by everybody who came afterwards. So when Baal Ma'or, little young whippersnapper, comes and attacks the Rif, he raises the ire of a lot of the big guns, including the Ravid and the Ramban, who both go after the Baal Ma'or with everything they got. And they try to take him down. And so whenever the Baal Ma'or talks, he's got the Ravid on one side and the Ramban and the Malchamos Hashem yelling him down, basically saying, you're wrong, and the Rif is right. You're wrong, and the Rif is right. Once in a while, he wins one. But very often, the Baal Ma'or is basically shut down by the big guns. So the Baal Ma'or says, Hada amrinan lo tzricha shecharko kodem zmano bidinhu dafilu ba'achila shari ela she'ein derech achila belechem charuch lahachi nakat lishna demutter ba'anas dekevan denafak lemitoras chametz loshna ba'achila loshna ba'ana shari. Okay, so what did he say? When you say charko kodem zmano, so really it's not only mutter ba'ana. Really, it's mutter ba'achila also. And you can actually eat the chametz after the time of the isser if you are charachat beforehand. So, what does that mean? That you can eat it after the zman isser. What are you eating? So many understand the Baal Ma'or saying that to some extent this thing must still be edible, because otherwise, why the heck are you eating it? Right? That's the argument. That's the question. Now, if you look at the end here, he says, right, the nafik leimi Torah's chametz, it has been removed from the category of chametz. So this would push you to say that it's actually, right, fully burnt. It has to lose its identity as chametz. So how does it lose its identity as chametz, but still is possible to be eaten? That's why this is such a hard view to figure out exactly what he means. And he's read in opposite ways, right? The Ran takes this line that it's nafik leimi Torah's chametz and says it's not edible for a kelev. That's what the Baal Ma'or is saying. If this is, you burn it to a point that it's not edible even for a dog, but you can eat it if you want to. I don't know why on earth you would want to. Even a dog wouldn't eat it, but if you choose, right, because you're mashuga and you want to prove that this charko is still mutter after the fact, right? Somebody double dared you to do it. You can eat it. You can eat it, even though it makes zero sense to do so. You can. That's one way of reading the Baal Ma'or. The second way of reading the Baal Ma'or is no. Whoa. And this is, as we'll see, is the view of the Ravid, how to read the Baal Ma'or. The Ravid says, no, the Baal Ma'or is saying that you singe this chametz, but if you start like looking at it carefully, there's actually a place where you can actually eat it. There's actually an edible part of the chametz, and he's saying that you can eat it, and that's crazy. That's what the Ravid basically says. That's crazy talk. Right, but Ma'or Daf Hey, so he quotes him, and then he says, Amar Avraham. So the English is the next page, so let's try and get it on so you can see the English too. Ze hachaser das lo yachshov badavar. Okay, you can see how strong the language is here. The Ravid says, this one who's lacking knowledge didn't understand the matter. That's how he starts. Okay. Milchamto shel Torah, in the war of Torah and ideas, right? We use pretty harsh language when we see each other, and we treat each other as people in the market. Utmost respect, but in the realm of the attempt to find truth, so the gloves are off, so to speak. Savor hu shehu ra'oi la'achila. He believes that after charko, this is still able and readily to be eaten. And if this was actually still edible, even for a dog, it would be problematic. So what is the Baal Ma'or talking about? Right? Even if a dog can eat it, you can't even benefit from it. Right? As we saw from the case of the moldy bread, that it has to be burned until it gets to a point that it's no longer edible for a dog. Hilkach einaroy el l'sreifa. It has to be burnt to the point that it reaches, right, that it's a coal, like the Rambam. And that's why it says you can only benefit from it because no one's eating a coal. There's no one who's eating, even on a double dare, you're not eating a coal. There's no possible way that you can talk about eating this stuff because it's not edible. If it was edible, it would be problematic. So it can't be edible. It can only be mutter bahana. It can't possibly be anything else. So that's the Ravid's rejection of the Baal Ma'or. But the Ravid reads the Baal Ma'or as suggesting that, in fact, the way charko works is that for some reason, if you burn that chametz ahead of time, that is enough. Even if there's still parts of it that are edible, that's enough to change it and to remove it from the category of chametz. Fascinating. Let's look at the next view, which is a little bit better, and then we'll get to the final view, which is the best. The Rimi Lunel. So the Rimi Lunel, right? So Lunel is, again, a city in Provence in southern France. And Rav Yitzchak Milunel was, right, one of the scholars who was around that time. He did not write a lot, but we have a short parish of his on Psachim. So if you have the Kovetz Mefarshim on Psachim, you can find it there, the Rimi Milunel. So he says, his language is Shecharko Kodem Zmano, the or. So you burned it by fire. How, to what point? And this is, I think, what the Weisvogel said. V'nishtane tamo umariso. It changed its taste and its look. Okay? So changing its taste and its look is what I would call Rav Rosenzweig's best friend. Because when learning with Rav Rosenzweig, one of the things that he often would do is he would use, right, what I would call ambiguous sources to raise possibilities. And we're not going to need this because we'll see the Sefer Michtam, who is another rabbi from Narbonne, which is another city in Provence, but Rabbeinu David from there. So we'll talk about his view in a second. But changing its taste and its look. So you can singe your chametz to a point where it changes its taste and changes its look, but it's still edible, right? That certainly does not necessarily mean you're getting it to a point where it's inedible for a human being and certainly not inedible for a dog, right? And so it's a very fair reading of the Rimi Lunel to argue that this is a much lesser category. Now, in the footnote here, this little 2 here, I have in my, right? So if you look earlier in the Rimi Lunel, back on the Mishnah, so he does seem to try to make this idea of Tamo Mariso pretty stark. He doesn't think that it's just like, you're not just, right, like roasting your rolls so that you get some nice grill marks on there for your sandwich. That's not what you're doing, right? This is, you are legitimately burning this bread pretty good. But even so, I think that Rav Rosenzweig's reading is fair, that it seems that it could be at least less than nifsal me'achilas adam, and certainly less than nifsal me'achilas keleb, that it's not edible for humans consumption and not edible for dog consumption. So it seems to be less than that, but still pretty serious stuff. And now let's get to the Sefer Michtam. And this is the clearest view of this Shita. Again, the Sefer Michtam, like the Rimi Lunel, is not a very commonly known Rishon. I have a little footnote here reminding myself. Rabbeinu David ben Rabbi Levi from Narbonne. He was a contemporary of the Tosfists and the Ramban, and he wrote a perush on the Rif as well as a perush on the Gemara. Says the Sefer Michtam, V'yesh she'omer, there are those who suggest, Demida amar charko, velo amar sarfo, since it used the language of charko and not sarfo. If you remember earlier, some of the Rishonim conflated this language. They changed the word, right? The Rambam even changed the word charko to sarfo. So the Michtam says, not so fast. The Gemara is very, 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 right, careful. Charko, right? It broiled or scorched or torched. Michlal sha'afil lo sarfo legamre. Even if it wasn't burned completely, im yaklof oso, that if you would peel back the top layer, yimsabo ra'i la'achila, you would find in the center of the bread a section that didn't quite get burned all the way, right? Imagine you have a marshmallow, right? And you burn the outside, it's all black, but in the inside, there's still a gooey center, right? So that's how he's imagining this bread. You singed it, you scorched it, you broiled it. On the outside, it's all black. But if you peel it back, if you cut it in half, the center of there might still be edible bread in there. Va'afilu hachi, nevertheless, muter b'hana lo ba'achila. He says you can still benefit from that chametz. You can't eat it. Ve'ein bo iser lo mishum bal yirav al yatzeh. You don't violate the prohibition of owning that chametz. And then he says, and I'm going to one up it because I'm going to read I'm going to take the Baal Ma'or at its most ambitious. The Rabbeinu Zachya Halevi, right, Zal, right? So the Baal Ma'or kasav dehu adin afilu ba'achila nami shari, right? So he reads the Baal Ma'or just like the Ravid, and instead of saying he doesn't understand anything, he says the Baal Ma'or says you can even eat it, right? You can even eat it. which is crazy. Think about that. You can take chametz and you can burn the outside real good, and then after the Zman Isser, you can cut away the burnt part and eat the chametz part, and you're not violating the Isser of eating chametz. That is an unbelievable view of the Sefer Mechta. The reason it says you can benefit and doesn't say you can eat it is because it's not normal to eat really, really, really burnt bread. That's the reality. Okay, so in trying to understand this view, I was thinking about, right, the whole concept, the whole idea of a vaccine. What's a vaccine? A vaccine is that if before you get sick, before you actually, right, have an ailment, you get a part or a piece, right, a small version of, right, the disease, and then you build up, right, a tolerance for it to the point that if you do at some point in the future get sick or get the disease, you now have already basically gotten to a point where you can handle it, right? And so the point of charko is that if you do enough to disengage and disassociate from the chametz, you singe it, you torch it. Any onlooker would say he doesn't want the chametz. That's not that. He's basically saying this is not for him anymore. By doing that act, even if you don't completely destroy it, according to this last view, you've done enough to basically, right, say it's now okay. And for me, what's most powerful about that structure, that idea of charko kodem zmano mutar bana afilu achar zmano, that you can do less early and you're covered even later, is when you think about life and you think about the challenges that you have in life, there are two ways of trying to approach them. One is that whatever happens, you deal with it, right? So you're not necessarily proactively working on anything, right? You have a challenge. Okay, so we'll go to therapy for this issue, and then we'll go to the rabbi for that issue, and we'll go to the doctor for this issue. And as you have issues, right, you call whatever you need to call, right? When the water, right, when your water main breaks, you'll call the plumber. When this thing breaks, you'll call that person. And basically, as things go wrong, you deal with them. The other approach to growth, to how you maintain your house, to basically everything, is that you're constantly looking for, how do I put into place certain mitigating factors so that when an issue might arise, I already have what I need to deal with it, right? So I'm going to work on my anger because I know that, right, at some point in the future, I'm going to have a situation where I'm going to be challenged. And so I'm going to try to put into place best practices ahead of time so that when that challenging situation comes up, I already have the tools at my disposal to deal with it. In my head, charko is the model of a vaccine, which is the model for proactive, right, engagement with our spiritual lives. How and what can we be charuch? Can we do charko to at this point, when nothing is usher yet, nothing has kicked in yet, right? Everything is, right, the world is our playground. We can choose how we engage with the world at this point because nothing is wrong. We have the ability to, right, work from a clean slate and say, I'm going to put into place this thing right now so that when the time gets hot, right, when chametz is kicking in, when all of a sudden the Zman Isser is here, I already have dealt with this. I've already done charko. I've already been proactive in burning this thing so that when it comes to the point where it's going to actually kick in, I got this. It's done. And I think that is for me, is a huge shift. And I'll explain why. And I mentioned this to some people who were asking me some questions about Pesach this year, with some of the struggles that people had with finding certain things. And they were asking me, I know last year we had certain kulas and can we rely on them? And my impression from talking to many of the poskim that are everywhere is that they're trying to shift our mindset out of a pandemic mindset back to what I would call maximalizing observance, which is that we're trying to get back from living a b'diavad lifestyle where things are right. We have to kind of do what we have to do because life is still challenging, and we're trying to shift back to right. What's the ideal way? What's the maximalizing? What's the optimal way of being Jewish? And yes, there still are a couple months and whatnot that we're going to have to make some concessions here, there, and the other place. But as much as we can start shifting our attention back to what, right, we would consider the normal way of doing things, and the idea of trying to be proactively Jewish and not just reactively Jewish, that's kind of the direction that we're heading at this point. We're at this inflection point with Pesach now. We're so close. We're not quite there. Right? Everybody who hasn't gotten their vaccine, please get your vaccine. But really, a lot of our community has already been vaccinated at least once. Many people have gotten their second vaccine. We're really starting to turn a corner. And the idea, I think, is for all of us to look ourselves in the mirror as we go into Pesach, maybe after we get into Pesach, because we're still a little bit stressed out for Pesach. But the idea is that when we have those couple of minutes on Yom Tov afternoon, when we're kind of sitting and we can't really do anything for the next night, and we have some family time, to reflect, what are a couple of areas of my Jewish life, of my personal life, that I want to do charko to, that I want to singe. I want to create and already put into effect certain safeguards so that when I get to dealing with these things, I am already set. I want to inoculate them. I want to already have them built in. And the more we see chametz as the Yetzer Hara, as the model that Chazal said, this is the drive, certain drives. What can we do with our drives? We can't just eradicate them. It doesn't work. They're too fundamental to who we are as human beings. What do we need to do? We need to hone them. We need to harness them. We need to find an understanding and understand ourselves and how we can maximize those drives for good things. The more that we can do that, the more that we can see our chametz and be charochet, and see our Yetzer Hara and be charochet, we can burn it, singe it, scorch it, prepare it, get it ready, deal with it. Then when right life starts and we have to deal with life, we already have everything in place that we can do with it. So that's all I got. I'll stop for any thoughts, questions, and you know what? Before we do that, let's just do a very, very quick recap. We started tonight with a Mishnah. The Mishnah has this repetitive language. It's mutter bahana, but also you can sell it to a non-Jew. You can feed it to a dog. And we asked, why do we need this extra word? What's the point of it? Pick one or the other. The Gemara asks this question, Pshita, it's so obvious. The Gemara says, we learn Rava's law. Rava's law is that charko kodem zmano muter bana fila achar zmana. If you burn this, if you singe the chametz before the time of the Isser, then once the time of the Isser passes into it, it's still going to be okay. You can still benefit from it. We saw 4 approaches to the idea of what that means. What does charko mean? We saw the position of the Rambam that you have to turn it into a kol beforehand. If you turn it into a kol beforehand, then it can still be used on Pesach as a kol. But if you wait too long and you try and singe it after the fact, it's too late. You can no longer say nasa mitzvah, so you can no longer say that its mitzvah was done and it's now afran mutter, that the dirt or the coal is okay. It's not going to be okay. Then we saw the view of Tosfos. The Tosfos says that the same standard that applies by chametz in all things, pasha ifsha, it has to be totally burnt to the point that even a dog would not touch it. If not, it's a problem. It's still a problem. Then we saw the view of the Ra'ah quoted in the Ritva, that no, pasha ifsha you can break and say it's only a tumah halacha. It's only a law about impurity and purity. But when you talk about the ideas of the obligation to be mevayer, to destroy, that only applies right up until nifsal achilas adam. When a human being will no longer eat it, at that point, you're good to go. You don't have to wait all the way to the point where it's even a dog won't eat it. Even if a human being won't eat it, it's already lost its identity of chametz. And perhaps you can use that to explain why if you're charuch before the time, then it's mutter after the time. But if you wait till after the time, then that's not going to work. That's not going to work. But the real focus of this year was the last view. The view that might be the view of the Baal Ma'or is probably the view of the Rimi Lunel, and is definitely the view of the Sefer Michtam, which is that Charko Kodem Zmano is that you don't even have to get it to a point where it's inedible. It can still be edible. The Michtam says you still can't eat it, but it can still, if you peel back the burnt part, there might be a part of that chametz that's still there, and that's okay because you dealt with it ahead of time. When you deal with things ahead of time, you have to do less. When you're proactive, when you do maintenance on your body, on your house, on your car, on your religiosity, on yourself, when you do maintenance on a regular basis and you figure out what do I need to be charuch, you won't have to deal with the major bills. You won't have to deal with the big problems that you have to go to therapy for. You won't have to do all these massive things because you already put into place things to deal with them, to be proactively Jewish, to be proactively working on yourself. And that's the message of Charko. And for me, it's the message as we have this inflection point with coronavirus, that we have to start thinking more proactively about ourselves, about our religion, or about our growth, and about who we can be over the course of Pesach. Thank you for joining, and I'll open it for questions.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, correct. Thank you very much.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi Neuman.
Okay, thank you all for joining.
Yes,
Thank you.
I have a kosher Pesach.
Hopefully.
And I will join you from New Jersey.
Sounds good.
Amen.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.
All right.
Right.